It is a game so ordinary, so familiar that nearly every child has played it. The rules are simple. One closes their eyes and counts while the others scatter. They hide in closets, behind trees, under staircases. Silence hangs heavy until the seeker begins to search. Laughter echoing when someone is found. The game feels harmless, even joyful. But beneath its innocence lies something ancient. The act of hiding in the dark, of waiting in silence, of holding one's breath while footsteps pass nearby. It awakens instincts far older than childhood. In those moments when the seeker draws close and the hidden body remains still, the line between play and survival grows thin. Some call it the most dangerous children's game in the world. Not because of accidents, but because of what sometimes hides alongside the children. A disturbing pattern exists across decades and across towns. Stories whispered late at night of games that never ended, of children who never returned from their hiding spots. They slipped away, leaving behind only an unfinished game, a seeker who never found what they sought, and a silence that lingers in the memory of those who survived. One such story begins in the dim blue of a suburban evening, when the streetlights flicker on and the world softens into shadows. A group of children laughed as they scattered into the dark corners of a neighborhood park, their sneakers slapped against pavement, their small bodies darting behind trees under benches into the tall grass where the fog thickened. The seeker pressed their face against a tree, counting aloud in a steady rhythm. 10, 11, 12. The numbers carried into the silence until the final call rang out. Ready or not, but not all who hid were found again. The search began as it always did. Giggles betrayed some of the younger children, their excitement impossible to contain. A pair of sneakers visible under a bench, a rustle of leaves where someone crouched too shallow. One by one they were discovered, laughter rising with each shout of "Found you." Yet one child remained unseen. The seeker circled the park, calling out. Minutes stretched. The laughter faded into uneasy quiet. The child had hidden too well. Or so it seemed. The friends searched longer, their voices turning from playful to anxious. They checked the slides, the swings, the hedges near the fence. They called the name again and again, no answer. The evening deepened, the fog thickened, and shadows grew heavier under the lamplight. By the time the parents were called, the game had shifted into something else entirely. Police arrived, combing the park with flashlights. But the child was gone. No footprints in the mud, no sign of struggle. Only the sound of the night air pressing against the silence of an unfinished game. Disappearances during play are not unheard of. But the disturbing detail is how often they echo the same circumstances. A game of hide and seek, a child who hides too well and then vanishes. In some cases, they are found days later in places already searched, as though they were returned by something unseen. In others, they are never found at all. The stories share a chilling consistency. Children speak of hiding and hearing something else moving nearby. Something that was not the seeker, a presence that lingered in the dark spaces, waiting in silence. Some described hearing whispers counting along with the seeker, a voice deeper and colder than any child's. Others claimed they saw shapes crouched beside them, unmoving, as if playing their own version of the game. By the time they dared to look again, the shapes were gone. Folklore has always carried warnings about games played in the dark. In some cultures, hide and seek is avoided after sunset, believed to invite spirits who enjoy joining the hunt. Parents once told their children that if they hid too long, something else might find them first. The warnings were disguised as superstition, meant to keep children safe indoors. Yet the stories that survive suggest something more than superstition. Consider the testimony of one survivor. She recalled playing hide and seek in her grandmother's farmhouse decades ago. She hid inside a cupboard, heart pounding as the seeker counted. She remembered the thrill of being unseen, the scrape of wood against her back as she pulled the door closed. But then in the darkness she felt another breath against her cheek. Not her own. Slow, steady, too close. She froze. For minutes she remained there, paralyzed, listening to the sound of something breathing inches from her. When she finally burst from the cupboard screaming, the others insisted no one else had been inside. The space was too small, too empty. But she never forgot that moment. To this day she cannot stand silence in dark rooms. The innocence of hide and seek is what makes these stories so unsettling. A child disappears not while wandering, not while lost, but while hiding in plain sight. The rules of the game turn against them. To hide is to place yourself in silence, in darkness, in spaces where eyes cannot see you. And sometimes those spaces are not empty. Parents often dismiss these tales as exaggerations, products of imagination. Yet the pattern lingers: the missing child, the unexplained silence, the sudden absence that transforms play into tragedy. What begins as a simple count of numbers ends with questions that never find answers. Why does this game, more than others, invite such stories? Why do shadows seem to gather when children scatter into hiding? What if the game itself is not merely play but an invitation? A ritual of silence and stillness that draws something out of the dark, something that waits for the moment a child holds their breath and believes they are safe? The question is not only what is sought during the game, but who or what is doing the seeking. Every childhood game carries echoes of something older. Tag resembles the chase of predator and prey. Ring Around the Rosie emerged from plague years. And hide and seek, for all its playful rules, is perhaps the darkest of them all. It is a game of concealment, silence, and breath held in terror. In its structure lies something primal, the knowledge that danger comes when you are hidden and helpless. In many cultures, parents once discouraged playing hide and seek after sundown. In parts of rural Japan, children were warned against a practice known as kakurenbo, a version of the game said to invite wandering spirits into the circle of play. In old European villages, whispers told of fae and forest spirits who would join games in the dusk, leading children away to places they would never return from. In the Caribbean, the lore shifted to duppies, restless spirits drawn to the sound of laughter fading into silence. Even in places with no shared history, the warnings were the same. Do not play the game when the shadows lengthen. Do not let the counting stretch into the night. Do not linger too long in silence because something else might find you. Folklore disguised these warnings as superstition, but their persistence across centuries suggests something more than coincidence. One particular case, still spoken of in hushed tones in a small Midwestern town, shows how swiftly the game can turn from play into horror. The year was unremarkable, the community ordinary, the families familiar with one another. On a summer night when the air was thick with the smell of cut grass and the buzz of cicadas, a group of neighborhood children gathered in a yard. Their laughter carried into the street as they argued over who would count first, who would hide where, who could run fastest across the lawn. The parents, sitting on porches, paid little mind. It was a safe neighborhood. The children often played until the street lamps buzzed to life. Hide and seek was nothing more than an extension of the day, a ritual of laughter before bed. But that night would not end the way others did. Among the group was a boy no older than 8. He was quiet, thoughtful, not the fastest or loudest of the group. When the seeker began to count, the boy slipped away into the darkness of the side yard, past the familiar fences, into the shadows near an abandoned shed at the property's edge. It was a perfect hiding spot. Too perfect. When the seeker called ready or not, the boy crouched low, smiling at his own cleverness. He would not be found this time. Minutes passed. Children were discovered one by one, laughter rising with each "got you." But the boy did not return. At first, his friends teased, assuming he was prolonging the victory. They called his name. Silence. They checked the shed, but it stood locked, the padlock rusted shut. They searched bushes, trees, even the gutters. He was gone. By the time the parents were alerted, dusk had settled into night. Flashlights cut through tall grass. Voices rang out into the fields beyond the houses. Police were called, dogs brought in. But no sign of the boy was ever found. The shed was eventually broken open, its interior empty but for dust and cobwebs. No footprints, no broken boards, no forced entry. The boy had vanished between the final number and the first call of his name. The case shook the community. For years afterward, children were not allowed outside after sunset. The game itself carried a stain. Even decades later, older residents recall the night as though it left a permanent scar on the town. The boy was never recovered. His name became more whisper than memory, spoken only in connection with the warning: do not play hide and seek at night. This case is not isolated. Across different countries, newspaper clippings and oral accounts trace similar events. Children gone without trace, last seen hiding in games. Some were found later, but always in strange circumstances. Inside locked rooms, inside closets searched hours before, inside crawl spaces where they could not have fit. Others were never found at all. The stories were passed on not as headlines but as warnings. The game itself becomes the ritual. One closes their eyes, counts numbers into the dark, then opens them to a silence filled with possibility. To those who have never suffered, it is harmless. To those who have lost, it is something else entirely. It is a game that blurs the line between child's play and a door opening onto something that should never be invited. The parents of that boy, long since gone from the town, left behind only fragments of their grief. Neighbors remembered how the father kept the porch light burning for months, refusing to let the darkness settle on the yard where his son had last played. Others recalled the mother speaking to herself in the early hours, whispering that she sometimes heard counting outside the window, slow and deliberate, even after the search ended. Folklore, grief, and unexplained vanishings intertwine, and the game of hide-and-seek becomes more than play. It becomes a ritual that repeats across centuries. The seeker counts, the hidden ones wait, and in that waiting something else may enter. The innocence of childhood blinds us to the danger, but history has left enough scars to suggest that the danger has always been there. And so the question emerges, is hide-and-seek a game that children invented, or is it a ritual that something older taught us? A way of luring the young into silence long enough for shadows to notice? The disappearance of the boy changed the town, but it was the smaller, stranger details that continued to haunt those who were there. They did not notice them at first. In the first hours after he vanished, the community thought only of finding him. Neighbors searched their yards. Parents called his name into the thickening dark. Police officers moved through the fields with beams of light that carved the fog into pieces. At that time, they believed he was near, that he would be discovered hiding in some clever spot, grinning at how well he had fooled them all. But the longer the search continued, the more wrong everything felt. The other children were questioned. Each one told the same story with slight but troubling differences. Some swore they had seen him running toward the shed when the counting began. Others insisted he had darted behind the fence, his sneakers flashing in the dusk. One child, shaking and tearful, claimed she saw him crouching under the slide, but when she looked again, he was gone. The contradictions unsettled investigators. How could he have been in so many places at once? Children misremember, they said. But the unease lingered, because every version of the story placed him in shadows that seemed to shift when no one was looking. The seeker himself described something that still chills those who heard it. He claimed that while he pressed his face to the tree and counted aloud, he heard another voice counting with him. A whisper, low and drawn out, repeating the numbers in perfect rhythm.
He thought at first it was one of the older kids playing a trick.
But when he lifted his head and glanced around, no one stood near him. Only the wind through the trees answered back. He tried to forget it, tried to believe it was his own imagination. But later, when the boy was missing, he repeated the detail to the police in a voice that cracked with fear. The timeline of the night grew increasingly fragmented. Parents insisted that the children had only been outside for minutes before panic set in. The officers claimed it was longer. No one could agree on when exactly the boy vanished. Clocks in different houses were checked, but each seemed to tell a slightly different time. 10 minutes felt like 30. An hour felt like seconds. The sense of disorientation only deepened the mystery, as though time itself bent around the game. By midnight, search dogs were brought to the yard. They sniffed the grass, the shed, the fence line. They picked up a scent briefly and followed it to the edge of the park, near a cluster of trees. Then, without warning, they stopped. They whined, circled, and refused to move forward. Their handlers pulled at the leashes, but the dogs dug in their paws, tails low, ears flat. It was as if something invisible barred their way. In the end, the animals had to be led away, trembling. Official reports described them as distracted. Those who watched knew better. The dogs were afraid. Stranger still were the signs found near the shed. When investigators pried open the padlock days later, they expected dust and emptiness. Instead, they found faint impressions in the dirt, small enough to be the size of a child's shoes. Yet they were not scattered like the marks of someone moving. They were lined in a neat circle pressed deep into the ground, as if the child had stood there for hours unmoving before vanishing into the air. Whispers spread quickly. Parents told their children to avoid the park. Some swore they saw strange shapes moving under the lamplight at night, shadows that did not match the trees, silhouettes that stood too still. One neighbor, an elderly woman, told police that she had been looking out her window that evening and saw the children running. She remembered clearly seeing two seekers standing by the tree, counting in unison. But when she blinked, only one remained. The contradictions built a puzzle that no one could solve. Police reports leaned on the possibility of abduction, though no tracks or vehicles were seen. The shed showed no sign of forced entry, the fence no breaks. No ransom calls came. No suspects were ever named. The child had simply ceased to be where he was. The evidence was less like a kidnapping and more like an erasure. The children left behind bore scars invisible to adults. Many refused to play hide-and-seek ever again. Some woke crying at night, insisting they heard footsteps in their rooms, slow and deliberate, pausing at the edge of their beds. Others claimed that during the search they had glimpsed the missing boy standing among the trees watching them. But when they ran toward him, he dissolved into mist. Parents dismissed these accounts as trauma, the result of shock. But the children knew what they saw, and children are rarely wrong about fear. The strangest piece of the timeline came from the boy's own family. His mother claimed that days after his disappearance, she heard him calling from the backyard. It was just before dawn when the air was thick and gray. The voice was faint but clear, calling her name from the shadows near the shed. She ran barefoot into the yard, heart racing, but found nothing. The ground was cold, the grass wet with dew. Yet she swore she felt the air still vibrating with the echo of his voice, as though he had been there only moments before. The case grew cold, but the details refused to fade. They repeated themselves in whispers and retellings and cautionary warnings. The timeline of the night never made sense. Each witness offered truth and contradiction in equal measure. And at the center of it all was a boy who never returned, a game that ended without laughter, and a silence that seemed to stretch far beyond one suburban yard. It is in these contradictions that the mystery deepens. A voice counting alongside the seeker, shadows that stood too still, dogs that refused to cross a line in the earth, impressions in the dirt that led nowhere. Every detail pointed to something unnatural, something that did not follow the rules of the world we know. The game of hide and seek had ended. But for those who were there, the real game had only begun. The question that lingers even now is simple and devastating. Who or what was playing alongside them that night? When the initial panic faded and the search grew colder, the investigators turned to the fragments left behind. They interviewed the children again, their small voices recounting details that at first seemed unimportant but grew darker under repetition. Every child remembered the counting, but it was not the seeker's voice that haunted them. They each described hearing something else layered beneath it, a whisper, deep and deliberate, echoing the numbers in rhythm. Some thought it came from the trees. Others swore it came from the ground itself. The seeker insisted he felt breath against his ear as he counted, though no one had stood beside him. The testimonies overlapped like strands of the same nightmare. The police dismissed these details as imagination, the way frightened children fill gaps with fantasy. But experts in child psychology were less certain. Children often embellish, yes, but the consistency of their stories unsettled them. How did so many describe the same whisper, the same sensation of being watched without collusion? When questioned separately, their accounts matched too closely to ignore. Evidence from the scene added further unease. The shed, when finally opened, revealed more than footprints. Along its wooden walls were faint scratches, shallow grooves dragged across the boards at uneven heights. They did not resemble tool marks or graffiti. They were jagged, frantic, as if something had clawed outward in desperation. Forensics could not determine their age. Some appeared fresh, others old, layered beneath dust. The marks had no explanation, only implication. The ground near the shed revealed something else. Investigators found patches of grass pressed flat in narrow shapes as if someone or something had crouched low to the earth watching. No human prints led in or out. The impressions simply began and ended, vanishing into untouched soil. A deputy described them as shadows burned into the dirt, a phrase struck from the final report. Contradictions emerged when adults were questioned. Several neighbors swore they saw the boy near the fence after the game began. Others insisted they saw him by the trees. But when pressed, each admitted their memory blurred, as though time had folded strangely that night. They remembered glancing away only for seconds. But when they looked back, he was gone. Some even admitted uncertainty about whether they had seen him at all, as if the memory had been implanted or erased. The police chalked it up to stress, but the adults in private admitted that the night did not feel real, that something had distorted their perception in ways they could not explain. Paranormal investigators, drawn by whispers of the case, compared it with other disappearances tied to childhood games. In one report from decades earlier, a child vanished while hiding under a porch. Witnesses claimed they heard laughter long after the search began, laughter too deep to be a child's. In another case, a group of children described seeing a second seeker, identical to the first, standing silently among the trees. When the real seeker joined them minutes later, the double was gone. These cases, dismissed by authorities, carried the same threads: whispers, shadows, and vanishings that left no trace. Skeptics pointed to memory distortion, the way panic rewrites perception. Stress can create false memories. Fear can amplify sounds, stretch shadows, invent threats. Yet even skeptics could not explain the physical evidence: the scratches inside the locked shed, the circle of footprints that ended abruptly, the dogs that refused to step forward. Hallucinations do not leave marks. Fear does not flatten grass in deliberate shapes. Theories multiplied. Some claimed the boy had been abducted, though no intruder was seen and no signs of struggle existed. Others whispered of sinkholes or secret tunnels, though the ground was solid and unbroken. A few suggested he had run away, though at 8 years old with no supplies that answer felt hollow. Each theory stumbled against the same wall. There was simply no trace of him. He had not left footprints beyond the impressions near the shed. He had not been seen crossing streets or fields. It was as if he had been erased from the world between one breath and the next. What haunted those who studied the case most were the timelines. Multiple clocks, checked across homes, disagreed on when the game had begun. Some families claimed the children had gone outside at 7. Others swore it was closer to 8. None could agree on how long they had been playing before panic set in. Investigators found that wristwatches carried by officers that night drifted. Strangely, minutes lost and gained with no mechanical explanation. Time itself seemed to stutter in the hours of the search. This detail, buried deep in reports, was never released to the public. But those who know it cannot forget it. Experts tried to rationalize it. Perhaps stress caused memory to fracture. Perhaps old clocks had been poorly set. But the feeling remained. The night did not follow ordinary rules. When the seeker closed his eyes and began to count, something shifted. The game marked a boundary, and once crossed, the rules of time and presence no longer applied. The mother's testimony added another layer of dread. She insisted that in the days following, she heard her son's voice calling from the yard. More than once, just before dawn, she awoke to hear him whisper her name from the shadows near the shed. She ran each time, finding only silence. The police dismissed her claims as grief, but neighbors later admitted they too heard faint sounds on those same mornings, counting, carried low on the mist. The deeper the case was examined, the more it resisted answers. Testimony overlapped, evidence contradicted, and logic dissolved. The scratches, the whispers, the double counting, the shifting clocks, each piece stood sharp, but refused to form a whole. Investigators could not reconcile them. And perhaps, that is the most disturbing truth of all. When the pieces do not fit, it may be because the puzzle itself is not meant for us to solve. The question grows heavier with each retelling. Was the boy hidden so well that he crossed into a place where only shadows seek? Was the whisper that counted alongside the seeker a voice from that place, marking the moment of exchange? Or was it something far simpler, far darker, that hide and seek is not a game at all but an invitation? The boy's disappearance did not end on that summer night. It seeped into the veins of the community, spreading slowly but relentlessly. At first, grief was sharp and immediate. Families huddled together, neighbors lingered on porches long after dark, eyes scanning the shadows as though expecting the boy to emerge from them. But as days turned into weeks, grief shifted into something else: paranoia, silence, and an unspoken understanding that the game had taken more than just one child. It had taken the innocence of everyone who remained. His parents were the first to fracture. They clung to each other in the beginning, united by the shared ache of loss. But grief has a way of dividing. The mother believed he was still near. She insisted she heard him in the mornings, his voice carried faintly in the mist, calling her name. She spoke to empty rooms as though he might answer. The father, more pragmatic, believed the boy had been taken by someone, an intruder, a predator hiding in the dark. He kept the porch light burning for months, sitting by the window with a baseball bat across his lap, convinced that whoever had stolen his son might return. Their differences grew into distance, each lost in their own version of the truth. The children who had played that night bore scars less visible, but no less deep. Many refused to sleep without lights on. Some wet their beds, their nights haunted by dreams of voices counting slowly in the dark. Others developed odd habits, checking closets before bed, refusing to enter basements, keeping their backs pressed to walls so nothing could stand behind them. They were children, but their play had been poisoned. The game that once filled their evenings with laughter now filled their lives with silence. When asked to join other games, they shook their heads, eyes darting toward the corners of rooms as though shadows might stretch and take them too. One girl, barely old enough to understand the word grief, drew pictures that unsettled her teachers. Page after page showed the same thing. A boy standing in tall grass, a shadow towering behind him, faceless and thin, its arms stretching too far. When asked why she drew it, she whispered, "Because it was there." Adults dismissed it as trauma, but the children believed her. They always believed each other because they had all felt it, the sense that something else had been there with them that night. The wider community grew restless. Parents tightened their rules, forbidding children to leave yards after dusk. Hide and seek vanished from the neighborhood. It was spoken of only in warnings. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. The smallest noises, a creak of wood, the echo of laughter drifting from the park, made people glance over their shoulders. Some families moved away, unable to endure the weight of absence in a place that still carried their children's laughter. Those who stayed learned to live with the silence, though it was a silence thick with fear. The psychological weight pressed hardest on those who had searched the longest. Volunteers who combed the fields swore they sometimes heard footsteps following them, though no one was there. Others confessed to hearing faint counting in the trees, the numbers always stopping just before 20, as if something was waiting for them to hide. Searchers returned home with dirt on their boots and a chill in their bones that no fire could burn away. Some never volunteered again for any search, too unsettled by the memory of chasing echoes that never led to answers. The case created ripples far beyond the town. News outlets reported the disappearance, stripping it of its darker details, calling it a tragedy, an unsolved mystery. But those who had been there knew it was more than that. They carried a fear that could not be broadcast. At school, the children avoided certain words. They did not say ready or not. They did not say found you. Even the mention of the game caused silence to fall. Teachers noticed how they flinched when numbers were recited aloud. Counting, once a harmless rhythm of play, had become a threat. The psychological collapse of the community was not sudden but gradual. Trust dissolved first. Parents stopped letting their children roam freely, stopped sharing meals on porches, stopped believing the neighborhood was safe. Then came the dreams. Families spoke of waking in the night to the sound of doors creaking open, of footsteps pausing just outside bedrooms. Some dismissed it as imagination fueled by fear. Others swore the dreams felt too real, leaving them sweating and gasping, convinced someone had been inside their homes. The boy's absence became a presence of its own. His empty chair in class, his name on roll call unspoken, the hollow space at family gatherings. For some, he was frozen in memory as the laughing child who ran to hide. For others, he was a shadow at the corner of their vision, always there but never fully seen. Grief had not ended. It had transformed into something unshakable. Psychologists who studied the case years later noted the long-term effects on those children. Higher rates of anxiety, insomnia, distrust of the dark. Some carried the scars into adulthood, still refusing to play games with their own children, still avoiding parks at night. A few admitted they never shook the feeling of being watched, even decades later. Trauma, the experts called it. But to those who lived it, trauma was only part of the truth. The deeper part was the suspicion that the game had opened a door that had never fully closed. The emotional toll was not only loss, it was transformation. A single night had taken the ordinary and twisted it into something monstrous. The families, the children, the neighbors, all became part of a story that could not be forgotten. A story that whispered even in daylight that something had played alongside them, something that had not left when the game ended. And so the psychological impact remains. A community fractured, children scarred, parents hollowed. The boy was gone, but what replaced him was worse. The certainty that he had not simply disappeared, but had been taken by something that watches, waits, and still lingers wherever the game begins again. The official investigation began with determination, but ended in silence. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed every household, and combed the park with flashlights until dawn. The first theory was the most predictable: abduction. The boy must have been taken by someone who slipped in unnoticed, someone who knew the neighborhood well enough to avoid suspicion. But the details worked against it. There were no tire tracks, no reports of strangers, no forced entry anywhere near the park. If someone had taken him, they had done so without leaving a trace. Abduction remained the explanation on record, but it convinced almost no one. The second theory leaned on the land itself. Some suggested the boy had wandered beyond the yard and fallen into a ditch, a drain, or some hidden opening. Search parties scoured culverts and checked old wells. Divers were sent into shallow ponds nearby. Nothing surfaced. The earth gave no answers, and those who had watched him run knew he never left the yard. He vanished within the boundaries of the game itself, in a place surrounded by friends. As the days stretched into weeks, other theories emerged, darker and harder to ignore. Some neighbors whispered that the boy had not been taken at all but lured. They spoke of old stories passed down quietly, warnings about playing hide-and-seek after dark, about voices that join the count, about figures that slip into games and take children as their prize. The tales were dismissed as folklore, yet their similarities to the night in question unsettled even skeptics. Psychologists weighed in, suggesting mass hysteria. They argued that trauma and fear had twisted the children's memories, that the whispers and shadows were inventions of their panicked minds. But such explanations ignored the physical evidence: the scratches inside the shed, the circle of prints in the dirt, the dogs that would not cross the field. It is easy to dismiss fear as delusion, but delusion does not leave marks. Paranormal researchers saw patterns too familiar to ignore. They spoke of entities that thrive in liminal spaces, doorways, thresholds, games. Hide and seek, they argued, creates the perfect ritual: silence, stillness, counting, waiting. The game itself becomes an invitation, a signal to something watching in the dark. They pointed to similar cases across continents, where children vanished or returned changed, their eyes hollow, their voices distant. Always during games of hiding, always at dusk. The police refused such interpretations, yet even within their ranks unease spread. Some officers admitted in private that their radios crackled strangely near the shed, voices breaking through static, faintly counting numbers that no one had spoken. One officer claimed he felt a hand grip his wrist in the dark, but when he spun around, he was alone. These accounts never reached the reports. They were buried under the weight of official silence. Conspiracy theorists took the story further. They claimed that disappearances linked to hide-and-seek had been quietly catalogued for decades, hidden in archives marked as unsolved child abductions. Some even alleged government knowledge, suggesting experiments in time distortion, parallel spaces, and entities that slip through when the veil is thin. To them, the boy was not the first and would not be the last. Authorities knew more than they admitted, they argued, but refused to reveal the truth. For the families, theories brought no comfort. Each possibility only deepened the wound. If abduction was true, their child was in the hands of someone monstrous. If folklore was true, then something not human had claimed him. If psychology was true, then their own memories were betraying them. And if conspiracy was true, then forces far larger than them were at play. Each answer was worse than the last, because none explained why the boy had never been found. The community clung to fragments. Some chose science, telling themselves it was panic and exhaustion that twisted the night. Others whispered prayers against spirits. A few swore they would never allow their children to play the game again. Not indoors, not outdoors, not ever. Fear fractured into belief systems, each family grasping at whatever explanation made their grief survivable. But beneath all theories lay the same truth. The boy had vanished in a way that should not be possible. He was there and then he was not. His absence was not explained by human hands nor by natural accident. Something had moved through the game and taken him, leaving only silence. Theories multiplied, investigations stalled, and reports gathered dust. Yet the fear never faded. Parents in the town still tell their children not to play hide-and-seek after sundown. They do not say why. They do not need to. The story itself is enough. And so the case remains open in the only way that matters. Not in files, but in memory. Not in evidence, but in fear. Each theory is incomplete, each investigation inconclusive. The silence of the shed, the whispers in the counting, the footprints that end abruptly, they are pieces of a puzzle that will never be solved. Because perhaps it is not meant to be solved. Perhaps the truth is too old, too patient, too hidden. The boy is still missing. The game is still played. And the question lingers like a shadow at the edge of every childhood laugh. When you hide, who else is hiding with you? The years passed, but the game never left the town. It lingered in the silence of backyards, in the faint echo of children's laughter cut short, in the way porch lights stayed on long after midnight. The boy was never found. The investigation closed on paper, but the story remained open in every whispered warning. What began as a simple game of hide-and-seek had become something else entirely. A wound that never healed. A mystery that refused to stay buried. What made it endure was not only the disappearance, but the questions that hung over it. Questions that deepened each time another family remembered their own close calls, their own stories of voices counting where no one stood, of shadows that moved when the seeker's eyes were closed. The game itself became a symbol, a ritual of silence and stillness that seemed to draw something near. Parents spoke of it with bitterness, calling it cursed. Children heard only fragments of the warnings, but they understood enough to feel the weight of the silence. Even those who had moved away carried the memory with them. They avoided parks at night, avoided games that involved hiding, avoided silence long enough for shadows to grow. Some admitted they could never listen to someone count without feeling dread curl in their stomach. Numbers once innocent became incantations. 10, 11, 12. Each syllable a reminder that when the seeker finishes, something else may already be waiting. Folklore had warned of this long before the town knew its own story. Do not hide in silence after dark, the elders said. Do not count into the night or something will answer. Across cultures, across centuries, the warnings aligned. The game was never just play. It was an invitation. The boy had been proof of that. And though he was gone, the figure that had claimed him was not. The most unsettling truth is how ordinary it all seemed. A summer evening. A group of children. A yard lit by street lamps. Nothing about it suggested danger. Nothing about it hinted at loss. And perhaps that is why the fear lingers most powerfully. Not because the night was strange, but because it was normal. Because the game was safe until it was not. Because the boy was there until he was not. Stories like this remain not because they are solved, but because they are not. They survive in the silence, in the unanswered questions, in the dread that grows heavier with each retelling. Was the boy taken by human hands, by shadows, by the game itself? No one knows. No one ever will. That absence of certainty becomes its own kind of presence. It follows you into the night, into the places where laughter fades and silence grows. It waits at the end of the count. The community has changed, but the silence never lifted. The old shed has long been torn down, but those who live near the park swear they still hear things when the air is heavy and the fog clings low. A voice counting, slow and deliberate. Sometimes footsteps. Sometimes laughter too deep to be a child's. No one plays hide and seek there anymore. No one dares. And yet elsewhere children still play. In fields, in houses, in yards across the world, the game continues. The seeker counts. The hidden ones wait. And in that silence, in that stillness, the same question lingers. What if they are not hiding alone? What if the game does not end when everyone is found? What if something waits for the moment when silence grows too deep and laughter fades too long? The boy is still missing. The stories remain unfinished. And the rules of the game are unchanged. Close your eyes. Count into the dark. Wait in silence. Ready or not, But ask yourself, when you open your eyes and the room is too quiet, when the silence feels heavier than it should, when the shadows lean closer than they ought to, who or what is really seeking?